The eye is a window to the body. It's transparent. It's the only place in the body where you can look in and you can essentially see the brain. You can see all these sort of markers of these other organ systems in the body that you can't access in any other way. There's all this information that's not visible to the human eye, but when you apply the ability of AI to look at these really massive data sets, predicting risk of a stroke, potential development of Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease, you generate these algorithms, you show that they work really well. There's no clear route to actually getting them out into the wild. You end up with an implementation gap.
Cascader. It's just been launched very, very recently.
Cascader is the foundation of a long-term partnership. We'll essentially build, validate algorithms, taking the research and turning it into a product.
There's a lot of hesitancy around AI bias. It's a much deeper problem than people first think. It's so entrenched in the system.
The key is to base it all on really high-quality research. There's all sorts of things in the human body that can be tested very easily, and we may find out some things that we didn't expect or didn't want to know.
Do you think in the far future, where someone can look at your eye and see your risk of death in the next 10 years? Today, Future Medicine AI is joined by Dr. Peter Thomas, Clinical Information Officer and Consultant Ophthalmologist at Moorfields Eye Hospital. Peter has recently launched Cascader, an AI company aiming to enhance disease detection through retinal imaging. We're going to be talking about his own personal journey, the story behind Cascader, and what he envisions for the company's future. So, Pete, do you want to just give us a bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Pete Thomas. By background, I'm a paediatric ophthalmologist, which has been sort of the main part of my clinical career. But I've had a slightly unusual path into medicine. So I started off working before university for IBM and spent most of university in sort of science disciplines. Went into visual neuroscience, so mainly computer modelling work of how vision works in the retina and the brain. And sort of through that, developed a real sort of, passion for the eye and for vision, but increasingly got the feeling that I wanted to be, much closer to, the real world in terms of, helping patients on the front line, for example. So that led to the idea of going to medical school, eventually specialised as an ophthalmologist, but kept throughout all of it an interest in technology, did sort of, research on things like augmented reality and virtual reality, started, messing around with some artificial intelligence work sort of in 2013-ish. And then as I became a consultant ophthalmologist, started picking up roles in terms of helping with digital innovation at Moorfields, which led on to national roles and rollouts of things like video consultations. And now to a role where I spend most of my time on digital health and essentially thinking about how we can transform the provision of eye care to be a more digitally enabled system. And now finally through to doing things like Cascader and our new company. Yeah,
cool. So why don't you tell us a bit about Cascader, because it's just been launched very, very recently between three institutions. We've got UCL, we've got Moorfields Eye Hospital, and we have Topcon Healthcare.
Yeah, that's right. So it's really sort of, three institutions that are kind of leaders in their own field. So, Moorfields has that world-leading clinical expertise and a depth of clinical data, which is obviously very important for medical artificial intelligence. UCL with world-leading expertise in medical AI. So one of my co-founders, Piers Keane, is one of the sort of, international leaders in both developing algorithms and developing the field of things like Oculomics, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And then Topcon, who provide vast amounts of diagnostic machinery, imaging of the eye, and have huge expertise in terms of developing devices. And so Cascader's really it's the foundation of a long-term partnership between those three organisations to help to ensure that a lot of the world-leading research work we do at Moorfields and UCL, that we've got a channel to bring that through into real-world clinical impact. Because, there's been a huge amount of research, a huge amount of papers published, a huge amount of promise from medical AI and eye care. And the real challenge now is bringing that through to the clinical front line. Because we have heavily overburdened health services, huge potential to be more agile, closer to home, basing care on the high street and in the community. And we can kind of unlock that by delivering clinical expertise.
Did you have any experiences at Moorfield that drove this Cascader initiative in particular? Was it like an influx of patients and you saw that ophthalmology was pretty much in crisis? Because I think it is one of the most adversely affected fields, I think, in healthcare. So did that kind of drive the incentive to form Cascader?
Yeah. I mean, ophthalmology and, often use the term eye care sort of more broadly, which encompasses both ophthalmology, which is the medical specialty and medical and surgical specialty that deals with the eye, and optometry as well, which happens on the high street through, well-known brands like Boots and Specsavers. Exactly. So that's a really large field. And if you just look at the hospital part of it, ophthalmology became the largest outpatient specialty in about 2017. It overtook trauma and orthopedics. And we have an aging population. As you get older, things tend to go wrong with your eye. We also have a lot of eye diseases that, historically haven't been treatable, but have become treatable, like wet macular degeneration, which, we've developed injections for over the last 20 years. So that means we have both a large number of patients and an increasing capability to do things for those patients, which means there's a very large burden on the health service.
Sure.
What we've seen is really eye care responding to that. It's been a bit of a canary in the coal mine. So there's a huge opportunity for us to, think more broadly, as we have been doing, about where we can deliver eye care services. So traditionally, they've all been locked away in hospitals. Over the past 10, 15 years, we've seen more and more clinical services delivered on the high street. So optometrists in high street practices, expanding their scope of practice, starting to do work for the NHS in terms of diagnosing eye disease, monitoring, seeing patients with eye problems. And it's really that change which has led us to have this opportunity to have really massive impact through things like artificial intelligence in eye care. So if you look at the machines we use in hospital, one of the workhorses for us is a machine called an OCT machine, so optical coherence tomography. And you go back 20 years, those were wildly expensive, and your big university departments would have one of those machines. Now they're in almost every branch of large high street optometry practices. So you've got this, really high grade clinical hardware everywhere.
Sure.
And what that means is there's lots of images that we can start to learn a huge amount, not just about the health of a patient's eye, but the health of their body in general from. So delivering an ability to interpret those images, to understand the health of the eye and the health of the body from those images right into the high street, rather than having all of your clinical expertise locked away in hospital.
Sure.
That's where we see a big opportunity for artificial intelligence to really empower more care to happen in more diverse locations.
Right. And this kind of builds on previous work from Insight iHub and the Moorfields researchers. They made a foundation model, RepFound. How is this initiative, how is this company, how is it going to be different to previous projects? What's the aim here? Are you trying to build more foundational models? Are you trying to build specific technologies that can be licensed to these optometrists?
It's a good question. So I think how I'd probably characterise it, and it's probably been the case for medical artificial intelligence in general, is there has been a huge amount of activity in hospitals and academic centres, developing algorithms, proving they work, often retrospective trials, publishing them. But the problem is you end up with what we call sort of an implementation gap. You generate these algorithms, you show that they work really well, but there's no clear route to actually getting them out into the wild so they're able to deliver benefits to patients, diagnose patients, help to detect disease early. And what that needs is a focus on the next stage of that translational pipeline. So how do we take an algorithm that's research proven and convert it into a product that can safely be used to treat patients? So that involves turning it essentially into a medical device, which has all the requirements around regulatory approval, which is a long and expensive process. It requires an organisation to accept essentially the medico-legal responsibility for running that. So I think how it differs is it doesn't replace all of that research work that happens. It provides a route through which that research work can be converted into a real-world clinical product that can be delivered in a way that's safe for patients. So it's taking the research and turning it into a product. So I think we're not the first to be doing that. There's other medical AI companies, obviously, but for us at Moorfields, for example, this is our first attempt now to say, right, this now needs to become a clinical product because there's a real unmet need there. So I think that's how it differs.
And I guess while other technologies are experimenting in this space, Moorfields, because of the huge amount of data that there is, you have a real opportunity to create valid clinical tools that could work across the population. And I guess that's what Cascader is tapping into. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, no, I think that's very fair to say. So I think each of those sort of 3 partner organisations, Moorfields, UCL, Topcon, they bring something to the table, and the combination of the 3 together is really powerful.
Yeah.
From the data side in particular, you're absolutely right. So, Moorfields is a massive ophthalmology organisation, so doing in excess of about 750,000 patient encounters per year, which is on a scale that's pretty much unparalleled in the Western world. And through work of many of my colleagues on the research side, including Pierce, my co-founder, we've been able to get a lot of that imaging data, into a state where it is research ready, where we've got high quality images all nicely filed away, nicely structured with all the metadata we need from an electronic medical record system, so that we have this really high quality data that's available to researchers. So via the Insight Research Hub, it is available to academic researchers and to commercial partners who wish to access it. And Cascader will essentially build algorithms or validate algorithms using that data set, and its depth of about 35 million images is pretty unparalleled in the ophthalmic world, and probably in the non-ophthalmic world as well. So yeah, it's a huge and deep resource that lets us build, validate. I think the other thing that's key as well is the resources that the NHS in general has. It lets us go beyond just the eye. So there's data to link that will give us insights into what else might be happening in a patient group in terms of what's happening in their neurology appointments, that kind of thing. So we have all those opportunities for data set linkage in the future as well. So
we've touched a little bit on Oculomics, but could you explain for our audience what Oculomics is?
Yeah, so Oculomics as a sort of concept has been maturing quite a lot recently. It's essentially the idea that to be a bit glib about it, it's sort of this idea that the eye is a window to the body. If you look at the eye as an organ, it's got some really nice features. So it's transparent. So you can look from the outside world and see right to the back of the eye. And what you can see at the back of the eye is a structure called the retina, and you can see blood vessels there. So it's the only place in the body where you can see the human vasculature. And you can see the optic nerve and the retinal nerve fibre layer. And those embryologically come from the central nervous system. So it's also the place where you can look in and you can essentially see the brain. So what that means is that the eye, it provides a place which allows you to understand the health of many other organ systems and tissues in the body. So Oculomics is that field where you take data from the eye, imaging data, genetic data, components of tears, for example, and you use that to understand what's going on in the rest of the body. Now, we've known about that in some diseases for a long time. So in diabetes heavily affects the retina, and diabetic retinopathy is one of the leading causes of blindness. So we've known for a long time that we can tell a lot about the diabetic status of a patient by looking at the back of their eye. We know that when you've got high blood pressure, your blood vessels get a bit sort of wiggly, and that can be a signal of high blood pressure. What we're finding out by getting these really massive data resources, by better imaging techniques, and by the ability to use things like AI to really understand that data better, is that it's not just those traditional diseases, it's also maybe predicting risk of a stroke, it's predicting potential development of Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease. So yeah, it's the fact that in the eye you can see all these organ systems or sort of markers of these other organ systems in the body that you can't access in any other way. And that allows us to diagnose, maybe in the future screen for, but pick up biomarkers of other diseases in a way that we hope can, support good medical care for a patient in general.
Would you say that because Oculomics has been around for a while in theory, but would you say that AI really unlocks its potential because AI can detect things that a human doctor might not be able to?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's interesting things that come out of AI. So, for example, there was some work that some of my colleagues at Moorfields and UCL did, showing that you can predict reasonably accurately a person's biological gender from a photograph of their eye.
Yeah.
And I've looked at an awful lot of eyes, and it's never occurred to me that was something I could look for. I guess why would you look for it? It's not necessarily that useful clinically, but it just sort of shows that there's all this information that's not visible to the human eye, but when you apply these tools that can really process much larger amounts of data than a clinician's eye and a clinician's brain can, that there's things you can detect in there. So the ability of AI to look at these really massive data sets, to look at multiple different types of data, and bring that into a single conclusion, I think that really unlocks it. The seeing big changes of diabetes, that's obvious at a first glance, but seeing more diffuse changes to a layer of the retina that could be suggestive of Alzheimer's, that's something that is, not so easy to see at first glance, that requires a analytics tool like AI.
And would you say that this is quite a unique opportunity for AI? Because in my mind, there's a lot of talk about AI being able to help clinicians diagnose things more easily and more quickly, but it kind of leverages the eye as a multi-organ sensor almost, which I think is quite unique. Are you seeing AI in that capacity in other fields, or is it kind of ophthalmology that it seems most exciting, do you think?
Well, I mean, personally,
you might be
for me,
biased.
Yeah, we're very biased. Now, yes, for me, definitely ophthalmology seems the most exciting. So, and it's not just because the eye is there to see and we've got these imaging modalities. It's also because it's so easy to do it. So, if you think about an MRI scan of the brain, there's loads you can tell from an MRI scan of the brain, but those machines are massive and they're super expensive and they're under huge demand for, treatment of acute conditions. Whereas an OCT machine, that's a fraction of the price, and there's several on most high streets. And you can take the scan on a conscious patient with a chin on the rest of the machine, and it takes 30 seconds. So I think it's not just that we can see all these things from the eye, it's also there's such ready availability of the imaging modalities. So there are so many places we can generate data, and the scale of it, it's insane. It's I think it was in 2022, there was an article came out, and it was looking at the number of OCT scans that Specsavers had done in a year. And I think it was something in the region of 8 million OCT scans had been performed by that one optometry chain in 1 year. So, we can infer from that 12, 15 million OCT scans per year being taken on the high street. So it's the combination of what we can see, and also that those scans are so easily and cheaply available, which then really unlocks that mass potential.
And do you think that in this way, this kind of supports the NHS initiative of moving from a decentralised healthcare system, so we have more community-based screening? For example, if you go to Specsavers and they take an OCT image and they pick up an elevated risk of cardiovascular disease, they can then refer you quickly and easily and safely to a specialist who can then do the thorough diagnostic testing. Do you think that's what Cascader is hoping to support in a way?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. So I think we've seen this very much in eye care, this sort of what's called a left shift towards providing more care in the community. And I think it applies equally for detecting eye diseases at a really early stage. So, at Cascader, some of the first work we're going to be doing is around macular OCT, building on algorithms that have been developed between Moorfields and UCL to diagnose, even very subtle signs of macular degeneration or all the other diseases that affect the macula. So we have that potential both within eye care, that we can use the scans that get performed all the time in the high street to detect disease at a very, very early stage, perhaps earlier than would previously have been clinically obvious. But then you're absolutely right. There's also that potential to say, well, actually, this eye looks really high risk for some other systemic disease. This patient looks like they're at very high risk of stroke in the next X years, and therefore they need a sort of diagnostic package to work out what their overall risk is. That's tremendously promising. It's also, a pretty significant responsibility to make sure we get it right, because what you don't want to do with these is overburden the health system by giving lots and lots of false positives. And I think that's what's really attractive about the model we've got with Cascader, is that it has, it can draw on really deep, not just sort of device expertise, but also the clinical expertise and the research expertise to understand, what are the consequences for developing an algorithm that will detect a certain type of disease. Is that something that will have a clinically useful endpoint, or was it something that will flood health services with vast numbers of false positives. And I think unless you have that mindset right from the start and do really high quality research, it'll be hard to produce algorithms that really help the health service rather than overburden it. And that's something we're really keen on doing, which is not just developing algorithms because we can, but also trying to work out what capabilities are most useful in the real world. And I think that's something where we probably have some real expertise that we want to build good products on top of.
That's really cool. I hadn't thought about the need to be aware of any false positives or adding to the burdened health system.
Yeah.
But how would you go about making sure that that doesn't happen? Is it about extensive model validation, essentially?
It absolutely is, and I think it's about getting that early research really, really right.
Right.
So
sure.
if you come from, let's say, a background that has less sort of expertise in research in ophthalmology, then it's very easy to imagine that you could get a data set of images and come up with an algorithm that does something and say, right, this is accurately detecting this disease 90% of the time, and get very excited about that and take it a very long way. But if you have that clinical and research expertise to understand that it's not just being sensitive to disease that's important in an algorithm, it's also being specific to that disease. And I think that comes in right at the start of the research process. So having the partnership we do in terms of the UCL research aspect of it, that's really important, because we need to have that in mind right from the start of developing everything, that there's more to being a useful clinical tool than just something that you can deploy and use on a patient. It also needs to be something that has a sensible endpoint, that has an outcome that's actionable and beneficial, and that doesn't create a large amount of noise and a large amount of worry. So
Sure.
you can imagine a product that tells lots and lots of people that they're at risk of something, creates a vast amount of worry while they have diagnostic tests that say, oh no, actually you're okay. So it's a real balance, isn't it, towards being really good at detecting something whilst also being really responsible in the way that you develop your products, so that you're not telling patients they might be at risk of something only to then reassure them several weeks later when they have another test.
Sure. And another risk I think that a lot of AI developers might feel is the risk of bias. But because you're working with Insight, is the hope that the models that you develop or any algorithms have enough data that we're kind of eliminating the risk of bias between different groups.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, eliminating bias completely is, that's the goal. That's the goal. I think with the depth of the data in the Insight Research Hub, and with the population that it draws upon, that is a very diverse population, it's about as good as you can get in having a resource to draw data from that will be less biased than if you had a data set based on a very narrow population, if you have many fewer images in it, or in another part of the world where there's, let's say, less immigration or a less diverse population. So I think it puts us at the start in a really good place. When you get into really, really specific diseases, so let's suppose we start, we do some work around a rare disease, then even then you start slicing things more narrowly, and your number of cases you may have may start to, then start to reduce the amount of diversity you have. So, I mean, Insight's an incredible resource to do as much as we can to give us the data resources to be unbiased, but it's never something we're going to be able to be complacent about. And there may always be a need to ensure that, we're also able to access data resources that can enhance that, or go out and gather additional data if it's needed for a particular algorithm. So I think it's a really very, very strong starting point.
I read recently a systematic review on AI bias, and it's a much deeper problem than people first think, I think, because it's so deeply rooted in the clinical system. And the research has basically pointed to the fact that, yes, there's a lot of hesitancy around AI because we don't want to exacerbate existing health biases. But how do we do that when the data it's trained on comes from a history of professional clinical bias? And it's so entrenched in the system that it's so difficult to weed it out. That was just a really interesting take. I don't know if you have any thoughts on AI bias and how it can be best tackled. But I guess it's just about bigger and better data sets at the end of the day.
I think it's. I think you're right. I mean, it's if you are training, if you have a learning system that you train on data that you're collecting from the real world, then even by making sure you have a very large data set and you cast the net very wide, you will still have all those sort of intrinsic cultural biases that could affect you in many ways in terms of how you're gathering that data set. But I think the key is to base it all on really high quality research. Yeah. So it's to be aware of sources of bias. So you can do many things to minimize the bias as much as possible by selecting good data, by augmenting the data set. But even then, you need to be conscious when you haven't been able fully to remove bias from that, and you need to take that into account when you're doing the research. And I think that's part of the strength of this partnership is, there is the research expertise to be aware of these problems. And I think that's where having this sort of an academic research partner is really powerful because, that mindset of saying, right, what are the potential problems with this thing we've developed? That's something that's possibly done more rigorously in academic research than in commercial research. So having that academic research partner in the partnership, I think hopefully also gives us an extra ability to protect ourselves against that. But yeah, you're right, it's something that needs constant work on.
Yeah. So you're like a leading expert in ophthalmology. Have you seen any really exciting research being done with Oculomics? Is there anything that's particularly exciting you about the field?
I mean, I think probably some of the work around looking at the eye as an indicator of disease elsewhere in the central nervous system is probably what's most exciting. So, obviously, for a long time we've known that there's been markers of cardiovascular disease in the eye, and we know we can see in diabetic retinopathy, and we know we can see changes of hypertension. The field where we're probably optimistically you hope that there'll be major breakthroughs in things like Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia over the next 10, 20, 30 years, and with the eye being such a easy way to visualize a part of the central nervous system, and with some work that for example colleagues of mine with the Alzheimer's study have done, showing that there's potential biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease within the layers of the retina. I think that's probably the really exciting thing for me, because we can see that there's hopefully going to be an explosion of activity and research and development of drug candidates, and to know that the eye can provide biomarkers that will help with that research, and then potentially in the future could give early indicators for patients who might be at risk of developing that, so that they can access treatments when they're available earlier. I think that's probably the really exciting bit, because it feels like that's an area of medicine that's ready to really, really develop. And, for the eye to be part of that, I think will be really exciting.
And again, supporting the transition towards preventative medicine, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
Exactly. And again, that's the beautiful thing about being able to have this level of clinical examination of the eye in a high street optometry practice, because, a lot of people, most people beyond a certain age, regularly go to the optometrist, and to have that imaging available, well, that provides a really nice way to do the detection, because unless a person does a test that allows something to be detected, it can never be detected. So yeah, I think that's really exciting.
Amazing. I'm aware that there, I think, are quite a few startups that are looking to develop tools that can easily detect like diabetic retinopathy or macular degeneration. But there don't seem to be, I don't know personally, but there don't seem to be a lot of tools being developed towards systemic detection through the eye, even though it's very heavily researched, I think, and it's really exciting. But what do you think is stopping people from advancing forward with clinical development?
It's an interesting question. So I think when we look at what we'll do with Cascader, we have we know that we can develop diagnostic algorithms for eye disease in the macula, and that'll be our initial focus. With Oculomics, I think what we can first see happening is probably more in a research field. So if you are doing a drug trial for, let's suppose, a new medication to treat Alzheimer's, you may want biomarkers to detect if that's effective, or potentially to identify patients who are going to be members in that trial. So I think what we might see coming through first in terms of developing AI around Oculomics is in support of clinical trials, so developing algorithms for the research sphere. That's probably going to be the first step, and then beyond that, longer term, as the field becomes more established, as we understand what the predictive value is, as OCT scanners gradually become higher resolution, as we do the earlier stage research to understand, not just that a particular appearance on an OCT might be suggestive of these diseases, but it's actually these changes are quite specific to this disease specifically, rather than sort of a general one. I think that's how we'll see it more slowly coming through into clinical practice. So for us, we'll be very much focused on developing AI around diagnosis and management of diseases that affect the eye. But the Oculomics bit, I think we see that coming through probably in supporting the research sphere initially.
Okay.
And then as it becomes more mature, then the potential to move into algorithms that would support that from an early detection or screening or diagnostic perspective. You do have those other things like hypertension and diabetes, though, which are really well established. So those I can imagine coming through very rapidly into clinical use. And in fact, there are already FDA approved algorithms, for example, that will detect and grade diabetic retinopathy. But for me, that's almost eye disease. That's diabetic retinopathy is an eye disease, hypertensive retinopathy. Those things that aren't diseases in the eye themselves, but rather in the rest of the body, but you detect through the eye. I think that'll be a little bit slower. But yeah, I hope in the not too distant future we'll be able to support research studies by developing algorithms.
And again, do you think that those algorithms that will be developed will need more than just an eye scan? As in, will it integrate lots of different data, like patient history, maybe genetics, previous disease, that kind of thing? Do you think that the AI will need that amount of data in order to, for example, predict someone's risk of Alzheimer's?
I think probably it'll be a question of, I guess, sensitivity and specificity it'll come down to. So, with a scan of the eye on its own, you might be able to have let's say, a 60% probability that a patient might develop a certain disease. When you start bringing in other data from other types of scans, from genetic tests, you may be able to combine those data sets to say, well, it's not just 60%, but we're getting to a 70, 80, 90% probability. So I think there will be capabilities that can be unlocked purely from a single scan of the eye, and there'll be others where you'll be able to build a certain amount of certainty by then combining data from different sources. So I think I agree. I think that multimodal capability to combine data from different types of investigations, I think will be an extra layer on top of just doing it from a single scan.
I recently came across a study that was it wasn't concerning, it was really interesting, but a somewhat daunting prospect, that the researchers used the eye as a biological clock and predicted mortality risk from UK biobank participants. So sort of retrospective, 10 years ago they had this eye scan. Did they die in the next 10 years? And the AI could predict better than more traditional methods, like telomere length, which was quite scary. That's nowhere near ready for clinical application. But do you think, if it is more accurate than more traditional methods that might require more intensive testing, like epigenetic testing, do you think that could be a use in the future, in the far future, where someone can look at your eye and see your risk of death in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, potentially it's something you can imagine. I think it comes back to what we were talking earlier about, that there's a certain amount of responsibility that has to be exercised. So whenever if you're going into, let's say, an optometry practice and getting an eye scan, you're not really going there to be told what your chances of dying in the next 10 years are. And, that would be quite a big thing to just lay on somebody after they've had an eye scan. So it's a question of doing it responsibly. So yes, it's, you might be able to show in a research paper that there's this relationship. Is the relationship strong enough that it then says that, right, on account of that, here's actions that should be undertaken? So the question is, are those modifiable risk factors? does it stack up in the same way as you might look at, let's say, a vaccination program? There's that public health angle to it. Does testing for this, does having that knowledge lead to something actionable that can help that patient? And I think that those are all the kind of questions that are going to have to come into that people are going to have to think about really heavily when they are thinking about developing algorithms that can act on an OCT scan that a patient just happened to get taken because they went in for an annual review to get a new pair of spectacles. So yeah, I think there's a big questions about responsibility, but I think we're going to see that in lots of different fields within medicine. There's all sorts of things in the human body that can be tested very easily, and we may find out some things that we didn't expect or didn't want to know. So yeah, for me it's going to be about actionable insights and about what's the level of certainty in this, and does the patient want to know that? Do they consent for knowing that on the basis that really they just wanted to know that their eye was healthy or not?
Yeah, fantastic. And then with regards to the future of Cascader, so you said at the moment the plan is for eye disease, like purely eye disease, and then maybe supporting research into Oculomics in the future. So is that the plan? In the next 5 years, where do you think Cascader is going to be?
So yeah, I mean, what we're hoping for Cascader is that it really becomes like a really good long-term partnership between Moorfields, UCL, Topcon, and yeah, the initial phase is very much going to be saying, look, we've done this amazing research to show that we can diagnose diseases of the macula better than most professionals in the field can do, and how can we turn that into a product that can support millions of patients? And that's the scale of the ambition, is that millions of OCT scans are done per year on the high street and in hospitals just in the UK, and that's the kind of quantity of patients that we're wanting to support with this. So these are capabilities that ethically need to be brought through into products because they can really help a lot of patients. But very much the longer term view, I think for us, is that simply is the first opportunity. And then we also want to look at, well, how can we support glaucoma management as one of the other major diseases of the eye, where we can see that bringing really good diagnostic capabilities and monitoring capabilities, independent of whether the patient's in Moorfields as a world-leading centre or a long way away from a world-leading centre. So that's probably the next phase, is looking at eye disease more generally. But the whole time we've got the eye on the longer-term future, and thinking about how we can develop the research findings that are coming out of UCL and Moorfields, or even potentially that we develop internally within Cascader, to start cracking that question around what can we helpfully do about systemic health from the eye as well. So yeah, it's not the focus of the very first piece of work, but it's definitely in the plans that this is where we want the company to be going.
Sure.
So we want it to be a company that specialises not only in diagnosing, detecting, monitoring and helping to treat diseases of the eye, but also doing that for the whole body as well.
Sure. And then we've spoken a little bit about clinical validation. Are there any big challenges you're expecting to face with Cascader?
Yeah, I mean, there'll be loads of challenges. I think in any sort of medical AI endeavour, there's so many unknowns, and the field has moved so incredibly quickly over the last 10 years that when you're looking at regulatory roadmaps and thinking a few years ahead, well, there's substantial unknowns about development of AI in general and what other new technologies might come along and suddenly disrupt things. There's also the question, which I think a lot of medical AI companies have really struggled with, which is how you actually take a product which you've got and you make it available in a way that can benefit patients. So you need to really think carefully about how do you get an algorithm to the data where it can be acted upon. And that's part of the strength of the partnership we've got. So working with an organisation like Topcon that manufacture lots of different diagnostic machines, including OCTs, and have a very wide install base, working with a partner like that helps us to get that route to market, that channel through which we can deploy the AI. Because without that, it becomes very difficult to say you've got a brilliant product, but how do you get the scan of the patient's eye to that product? And that's something that has been a struggle between optometry and ophthalmology over many years. So that's going to be one of the challenges, and one of the challenges that we hope that this partnership can really be supportive with, because we tick off the clinical expertise, the data with Moorfields, we click off the research expertise with UCL, and then the device, the imaging expertise, the commercial expertise, and the route to market with Topcon. So I hope that we've mitigated that challenge, but I think that's a challenge for sort of medical AI companies across the board. And then I'm sure there'll be all sorts of other challenges,
all sorts of things,
well.
yeah. Especially because it looks like the government still don't really know how to properly handle AI regulation. I know that like earlier this year there was that big action plan. They're like, we need to get out that AI regulation. We need to sort it out. But I'm not actually sure what that regulation is going to look like yet. So still really quickly changing field.
Absolutely.
But really exciting still.
Yeah, and I mean it's been like this for a long time, hasn't it? I mean, we've had lots of excitement about AI in the past, and we've had AI winters and stuff, and we're clearly in a phase now where we're on the brink of something, and we've seen widespread deployment of AI for stroke diagnosis. So yeah, it's just a matter of making sure that we're not just thinking about what our algorithm can do, but also making sure that it's doing something useful, that it's meeting an unmet need, and that it's deployable and it's implementable. And that's what I've spent a lot of the last 10 years doing, which is saying, right, what actually makes a good implementable digital health solution, so we can actually try and transform services at scale. Because anything like AI, you can't just shove it into a clinical pathway and assume that clinical pathway doesn't change. It's a transformation piece. It changes clinical pathways as well. And having those two alongside, the technology and the change that's required in order for that technology to deliver benefit, those are two things that have to go alongside each other.
Sure. And then a bit about your background as well. How do you manage being both a consultant ophthalmologist at Moorfields and now a CEO of a tech startup?
Yeah, I've had kind of a weird career probably over the last sort of 5 to 6 years, which sort of helps me on that. So before COVID, I was pretty much purely clinical. And then during COVID, I was invited by NHSX to be clinical lead for eye care nationally, and look at ways that we could try and transform eye care. And through that, we sort of developed this digital hospital model. The idea being that you need organizations that can deliver care remotely and at scale. And those organizations might look quite different to a traditional hospital. And through that work, I've been spending more and more of my time on digital health. So now, actually, my main job really isn't being a consultant ophthalmologist anymore. It's acting as a chief clinical information officer for Moorfields. It's having been a national digital clinical lead for NHS England. I spend some time in research now. And there's been this sort of gradually growing digital part of my career. And so, yeah, it's not quite the jarring transition that it would have been, I think, going straight from just being a pure clinician. It's been sort of gradually building now. But there's a definite balance to be struck. And I think probably, it's one of those things, it's probably a matter of remaining open-minded as to, which direction the career takes in the long term. But I think certainly now, I think a key frustration for me, which I think is felt by many of my colleagues in digital health, is that we've spoken about these technologies for so long, and we're yet to see the really transformational change from it.
Sure.
And I think that's the reason why I'm really enthusiastic to take this on as a challenge, because it's a real opportunity now to take everything I've learned about digitizing care and use that to get these, this incredible research into products that we can then start distributing at scale.
Fantastic. Really good to talk to you.
You too. Thank you very much.